Hi, I'm Rubin Miller and I'd like to welcome you to the second episode of How to Use Gimp. In this episode we're going to look at layers, what they are and how to use them. We're also going to look at some of the most commonly used tools. We're going to really explore the colour menu and how you can make those really dull pictures look bright. We're going to look at how you can change the colour in some parts of your image. What alpha channels are and how you can make one, as well as an introduction to layer masks. So let's get started. First of all, what are layers? Well, if you imagine that this picture that you see on the screen is a real picture that's printed possibly in a magazine or something like that, and you grab a paintbrush loaded with black ink and you start painting on your image, it's pretty difficult to get that paint off. If you get an eraser, for example, and start erasing, all that's going to happen is you're going to erase that paint back to the original paper. So I'll just undo that. So in the early days, somebody came up with an idea of using layers. Now, what a layer is simply, you can think of it as a clear sheet of plastic which is placed over that printed image. So here we'll create a new layer, and if we paint on the plastic, you'll see that whilst it looks exactly the same, we can now get an eraser tool and simply erase that paint away. We can also get our move tool, for example, and move just the paint. In fact, we can hide that layer altogether so we don't see the paint at all, or show it again, or in fact delete the whole layer, and that takes us back to our original. So a layer is simply a clear sheet of plastic which you put on top of your printed image. Now, just as you can have one layer, you can have multiple layers, and you can have something different on each layer. Layers also help you to preserve your original. So in this case, for example, this might be the only copy I have of this photo of my friend Tom. Now, I would have downloaded this onto my computer from my camera and then wiped out the original along with any other photos I had on my camera so that I could have more space on my memory card. If I then start painting on this original photo and forget to undo it and just save that, it will save over the original, and this photo will be totally destroyed. What I can do though is, if you look in your layers panel, you'll see that along the bottom of the layers panel you have various buttons. That button is to create a brand new blank layer. That is to create a group, as in a file. Those two buttons are to shift layers either up or down, and that particular one there is to duplicate a layer. So it's always a good idea, before you start working on an image, to click on the layer in question and then click on the duplicate button, which will give you a copy. If you do that and anything goes wrong with the copy layer, you still have your original that we can work on. So that in a nutshell is what layers are all about. Let's see how we can use our colors panel to make some adjustments to this. So in this image we have a classic case of a photo being shot in bright sunlight. So we have a huge amount of contrast. It's way too bright on that part of his face, and it's way too dark on this part of his face and body. In the colors panel, or the colors menu, we have various tools that we can use. Probably the most obvious looking one would be brightness and contrast. So when we click on brightness and contrast, a dialog pops up and it allows us to change the brightness and contrast. Bringing the brightness up makes it lighter. Bringing the contrast up makes it increases the contrast. Or if we bring the contrast down, it decreases the contrast. Now you'll probably realize that this is not working terribly well. And to be totally honest, I don't like using brightness and contrast at all because I find it gives us a really muddy finish. So I'll just cancel that to take it back. And once again, we can go to the colors menu. And this time, instead of brightness and contrast, let's look at levels. Once again, a dialog box pops up. It looks pretty complex. So the first thing we can see here is a graph. That graph is called a histogram, and there are two ways of looking at the histogram, either the linear histogram, as we can see it now, or a logarithmic version of it. All that histogram actually tells us is how pixels are distributed in this image. So if we look at the linear histogram, we can see that we have a lot of pixels over on the left-hand side, which is the shadow areas. We don't have too many pixels over here in our midtones, and we've got a bit of a peak on the right-hand side where we have our highlights, and that would correspond to that area of his face and possibly this flower over here and some highlights over there. I'm moving the midtone slider around. You'll see how we can reduce the contrast in the shadow areas of his face. You've got your input levels over here, which increases the contrast. You've also got your output levels at the bottom, which decrease contrast. So if you want to decrease the contrast in the shadow areas, for example, we can pull that one in slightly and maybe decrease the contrast in the highlights as well by bringing that in. And when we click OK, you'll see that it's quite an improvement over the original. You'll recall that we've actually got two layers. The original layer, which was the original photo, we then duplicated it and made adjustments on the duplicate layer. By hiding the duplicate layer, you can see what the image looked like before, and by showing it after. You'll notice that on the left-hand side of the layers panel, we have a column that has eyeballs in it. To hide a layer, you simply click on the eyeball so that it becomes invisible. To show the layer, you click on the column where the eyeball should be to make it visible again. So by hiding or showing these eyeballs, you hide or show the visibility. If we hide the visibility of the top layer, we can see the bottom layer coming through. If we hide the visibility of the bottom layer, we get this checkerboard effect, which effectively tells us that we've got transparency. Because the layers are sitting on top of each other, if we make the top layer visible, you can see the top layer, but of course it totally covers the bottom layer, so it makes no difference if the bottom layer is visible or not. Another tool we've got in our arsenal is the crop tool. The crop tool is that tool in the toolbox, and when we use the crop tool, we have the option of using guides or no guides at all. At the bottom part of the toolbar, we can see our tool options, and you can see that we've got quite a few different options there. We can crop just the current layer, or we can crop through all layers. We can, in fact, crop to an extent by making the window much larger, we can actually increase the size of the canvas, if you like, altogether. We can expand from the center outwards. We can also set a fixed ratio if we really want to, as well as a fixed position. We can also use guides. At the moment, we're not showing any guides, but you can show guides. To use the crop tool, you simply bring your pointer into your image, click and drag, and you get a rectangle. Anything inside the rectangle is going to remain. Anything outside the rectangle is going to be cut away as if with a pair of scissors. Now, having clicked and dragged, the rectangle, you'll notice, has corners showing. When you put your pointer in a corner, you can actually move that corner. You'll also notice that if you put your pointer on either the top or bottom, or right-hand side or left-hand side, you get a disappearing rectangle. That again is a handle which allows you to move inwards and outwards. Now, one of the reasons we'd crop an image is to improve the composition. And we actually have some hidden tools in the crop tool which allows us to use guides to improve the composition. In the tool options for the crop tool, you'll see that in this area over here, we have some options. We can have center lines, which go right through the middle. Never a good idea for good composition. You've got the rule of thirds, which divides the image into 3 parts vertically and 3 parts horizontally. This is probably the most commonly used compositional tool because those third lines are the most powerful parts of your image. So when you take a portrait, for example, rather than popping your subject right in the middle as it is now, by positioning your crop so that where these lines intersect become the most important part of your image. So in this case, for example, that might make a far better image than that. So let's crop it to that position. When you're happy with the way your crop box is placed, simply press the return button and you'll see that your image is has now been cropped. So that's the after and that's the before. I'm sure you'll agree that that is a much more pleasing composition than that. Now here we have a problem of a different kind. Here we have an image that's got a huge blue cast, which we might want to get rid of. In fact, it could be a blue cast, it could be a yellow cast, depending on what white balance your camera was set at and where you took the image. Once again, we can use levels to sort out this problem. If we go to the Colors menu and go down to Levels, this dialog box appears once again. Once again, you can see that we can actually make some adjustments to the brightness and contrast by moving these sliders around. But that's not fixing the color casting anyway. We actually have some buttons near the bottom of this dialog box. The one is marked Auto, and you can click on that, and in this case it does a pretty good job. We'll reset that though and show you a different way of doing that. You also have these 3 eyedroppers which allow for us to pick the black point, the white point, and the midtones. So in this case, let's find the whitest part of the image, which I believe would be in about that position there, and simply click, and you'll see it sets that point to absolutely white. We can also get our black eyedropper and find a black part of the image, which I should imagine would be about here, and click on that. And that sorts out our color cast very nicely. Now here we have a problem of a slightly different kind in that the image is very overexposed, so we've got lots of light values but very few midtones and probably no real blacks at all. But before we start working on it, good practice dictates that we should actually duplicate the layer. So we'll go to the Layers panel, click on the base layer, and once again just click on the Duplicate button, so we now have a copy of that layer. So should anything go wrong, we have a copy that we can throw away. Once again, we can go to our colors menu and go down to Levels. And with looking at the histogram, we can actually see that we've got lots and lots of information from the midtones to the highlights, but really no information in the shadows at all. Now, this time, instead of moving these sliders around as we have previously, we're going to look at curves. Curves and levels are exactly the same thing. They both show you how pixels are distributed across your image, but they have slightly different controls. You can either get to your curves by clicking on this button over here, or if you go to the colors menu and you go to curves, it's exactly the same thing, just two ways of getting to the same place. Once again, we can see our histogram, which shows lots of information in the highlights, no information at all in the shadow area. So what we're going to do is click on that button at the bottom and just move the line to pretty much where the data starts. One of the beauties of using curves is that you can create what's called an S-curve, and you create S-curves to increase contrast. So what we'll do is click on this line over here and drag it up a little and go about 2/3 of the way down and click and drag that inwards, so that we've now got this S-shaped curve, and you can see how much more contrast the image has. So we'll just click OK to confirm it. Now what we'd also like to do is change some of the red areas in the image to a different color. And the way we can do that is to go to the colors menu and go to hue and saturation. Dialog box pops up and asks us which colors do we want to change. In this case, we want to change the reds. Now you'll remember that hue is tantamount to color, so if we move the hue button around, you can see that all the reds in our image are starting to change. So the more we move the hue button around, the more those colors change. So we'll leave it at blue just for the fun of it and click OK, and we can see that what was red, by hiding the top layer, what was red has now turned to blue. Unfortunately, we also have some problems in as much as some of the shadows in the sand have also turned to blue. I think they were shadows, they might be seaweed or something like that. So that is really pretty unacceptable. So because we have two layers, one which has got a color change and one which hasn't, one would imagine that we could actually simply erase these areas here to see the layer underneath. Let's see what happens if we try and do that. So we'll get our eraser, we'll get a nice big brush, maybe 100 or so, and you can see that it doesn't exactly work, because what is actually happening is we're simply painting back to our background color, which in this case is white. So we'll just undo that by pressing Command Z on a Mac or Control Z on a PC. Now we have to find some way of making that transparent. And one of the ways we can do that is by making what's called an alpha channel. To create an alpha channel, you just bring your pointer onto the layer in the Layers panel and right-click. And you'll see that a menu, a pop-up menu appears. Now, one of the things that is shown on the pop-up menu is to add an alpha channel. So if you simply click on that, nothing appears to have happened. But if we start erasing now, you'll see that instead of erasing back to our background color, which in this case is white, we're actually erasing right through that layer so that we can see our bottom layer underneath. And we can see that by hiding the bottom layer, and that actually shows this transparency. In other words, we're looking right through the layer that we're currently working on to the bottom layer if it were there, but if it was hidden, we're seeing right through it to nothing. So that is alpha channels. Now, unfortunately, if we wanted to bring this back, there is no way we could do that. So if we wanted it to be blue once again, there's no way that we can do that. And that's where something called layer masks come in. So before we look at layer masks, let's look at something called history panel. As part of this group of dialogues, we've got something called a history panel or an undo history. An undo history, every time we do anything to an image in Gimp, it creates what's known as a state. So each time we do something, we create a new state, and that's recorded in the undo history panel. Now, there are a few things you need to know about states. First of all, a state lives in RAM. So if you were to save this file, close it, and then open it again, there would be no undo histories. So they are only true for this particular session. The other thing about undo histories is they're not unlimited. They are, the number of undo histories you have is dictated by the amount of RAM you've got on your computer, as well as the size of the image. So the greater the size of the image, the less RAM you've got, the fewer undo histories will be recorded. But what's great about undo histories is whilst the image is still current, you can actually step back by clicking on the various states. So you can see this is where we added an alpha channel, and that is the state before the alpha channel. So you can step back to any state if you made a mistake and then continue working. So we'll step back to just before we created an alpha channel. And you'll recall that at that state, if we try to erase any of this seaweed or shadows or whatever they were, we just erase back to a background color, which is white. So we'll just undo that. And let's go back to our layer panel. What we're going to do this time, instead of creating an alpha channel, we're going to go to the Layers menu and go down to Mask and add a layer mask. Dialog box pops up and asks us what we want to fill it with, how we want to create it. The one thing you've got to know about layer masks is that they are attached to layers, and wherever that layer mask is white, that layer is visible. Wherever the layer mask is black, that part of the layer is invisible. So we'll leave this at white for the moment and click on Add. And let's look at our Layers panel. You can see something new has appeared here. Next to this particular layer, this mask has appeared. So a layer mask is truly a mask. As I said before, wherever it's white, that layer is visible. Wherever that's black, that layer is invisible. Now, one of the tricks of working with layer masks is to make sure that it's the mask you're painting on, not the layer itself. So in this case, let's click on that mask to make sure that it's selected. And we'll get our paintbrush and make sure our foreground color is black. So we're painting on the layer mask now. And you'll see that where we paint, it actually becomes transparent, just as it did when we had an alpha channel. So what's the point then in making a layer mask as opposed to an alpha channel? Well, you'll remember that with an alpha channel, if we wanted to go back, the only way to do it was to step back to an undo history state. So in other words, we could step back to seeing all of this purple or none of it purple. But what if we want some of it purple and some of it brown? Well, all we have to do is, on our layer mask, paint with white instead of black. So white makes everything on that layer, that particular layer, visible. Painting with black makes it invisible. So we can go backwards and forwards as many times as we like without affecting the layer in any way permanently. In fact, you can even save this file as an XCF file, come back tomorrow or next month and continue painting with black on the layer mask to hide whatever's on that particular layer, or flipping it over and painting with white to make whatever is on that particular layer, which is attached to the layer mask, visible. I hope you found this tutorial interesting. If you want copies of any of these photos, please email me. I'll leave my email address after the end of this. So thanks very much for watching.